What happens when a man who has spent years building an empire discovers that the very foundation of his success is tainted with neglect? Ethan Carter, the billionaire CEO of Brightmart, had always prided himself on being a different kind of leader, one who valued his employees as much as his profits. Yet, in recent months, whispers of discontent had reached him, rumors of toxic management practices, employees struggling to survive on meager wages, and a store manager whose heart was colder than the tile floors beneath his workers' feet. Ethan had read every report, studied the numbers, and even sent an internal audit team. Still, something gnawed at him, a feeling that the truth had been carefully buried beneath corporate jargon and doctored spreadsheets. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to feel what his employees felt, not from the lofty heights of a boardroom, but from the ground level, among the people whose hands kept his business running. Dressed in a faded hoodie, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he stepped into one of his busiest Brightmart locations. His heart pounded harder than it had in years. The store smelled of disinfectant and cheap plastic, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Employees moved between aisles, eyes downcast, shoulders tense. He had been here before many times, in fact, but always as the CEO, with his name stitched into the fabric of his tailored suits, and his presence met with forced smiles and rigid posture. Today, he was no one, just another customer. He picked up a pack of gum, his fingers tightening around the crinkled wrapper as he walked toward the checkout lanes. A line had formed at Register 3, where a young woman was scanning items with mechanical efficiency. Her name tag read Jessica. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, and her uniform looked a size too big, as if she had shrunk beneath the weight of something unseen. Next, she called out, her voice flat, exhausted. Before Ethan could step forward, another voice cut through the air, sharp and impatient. "Jessica, you're over your break time again. Move it." A man in a navy polo and khakis loomed behind the register, arms crossed, a frown carved deep into his face. Ethan recognized the name embroidered on his shirt, *Mr. Reynolds Star. Store manager. Jessica flinched, her fingers fumbling with the scanner. I'm almost done with this line, sir." Reynolds exhaled sharply. "I don't care. We have policies for a reason." Jessica cast a desperate glance at the remaining customers before forcing a stiff nod. "Yes, sir." She muttered a quick apology to the next person in line before stepping away, her back rigid with barely restrained frustration. Another cashier took her place instantly, as if the moment hadn't just unfolded before a dozen witnesses. Ethan watched her retreat toward the employee break room, a silent storm brewing beneath her carefully controlled expression. He followed at a distance, keeping his steps casual, blending into the background as he trailed her. Through a narrow hallway, past the towering stacks of inventory, he found her leaning against a chipped locker, her hands gripping the metal so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She exhaled shakily, reaching into her pocket and pulling out her phone. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she pressed it to her ear. "Hey, baby," she whispered, her voice softening in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Mommy's just on a quick break. Did you eat?" A muffled, childlike voice responded on the other end, and Jessica's lips curved into a weary smile. "Good. I'll be home soon, okay?" She hesitated. "No, sweetie, I don't know if I'll get more hours." "I'm trying." She bit her lip, nodding at nothing, eyes glistening. "I promise I'll figure it out. I love you." Ethan turned away, giving her the illusion of privacy even as his mind reeled. A single mother, barely holding on, begging for extra hours just to survive. And Reynolds had dismissed her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. He moved back toward the main store floor, his pulse hammering in his ears. A sharp voice pulled his attention back toward the registers. "Are you serious, Luis?" "Reynolds again." Ethan stopped. The cashier, *Luis*, according to his tag, stood frozen as Reynolds jabbed a finger toward the screen. "You're taking too damn long. These customers don't have all day." Luis, barely more than a teenager, swallowed hard. I just started last week, sir. I'm still getting used to." "I don't want excuses. Either speed up, or I'll find someone who can." A thick silence settled over the front of the store. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others watching with uneasy curiosity. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. Reynolds wasn't just strict, he was cruel. Ethan turned back toward the employee hallway, forcing his breath to even out. He couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. He had seen enough for one night. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, everything would change. Ethan returned to Bright Mart the next day, blending into the steady flow of customers streaming through the sliding glass doors. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying every interaction, every sharp reprimand, every silent plea for help. He had built this company from the ground up, but somewhere along the way, the very people who kept it running had been reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. He needed to see more, needed to understand the full scope of what was happening behind these walls. Grabbing a shopping cart to maintain his cover, he maneuvered through the aisles, his sharp gaze sweeping the floor. Employees moved with robotic efficiency, their faces void of energy, as if years of exhaustion had carved permanent lines into their expressions. He spotted Jessica near the produce section, stacking oranges with methodical precision. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her movements tense, as though she was waiting for the next reprimand to fall on her like an anvil. A few aisles down, Louis stood at the end of the frozen food section, restocking shelves with stiff, deliberate movements. The nervous glances he threw over his shoulder told Ethan that Reynolds' words from yesterday still lingered like a specter, gnawing at his confidence. Then, as if summoned by the mere thought of him, Reynolds appeared. He strode across the floor with the presence of a man who relished control, his expression set in a permanent scowl. The employees shrank slightly as he passed, each one instinctively lowering their gaze. Ethan felt his blood simmer. He followed at a distance, pretending to browse the shelves as Reynolds approached Jessica. She tensed as soon as she saw him, her hands pausing mid-movement. "Why are you still on this?" Reynolds' tone was sharp, condescending. "I told you this should have been done an hour ago." Jessica swallowed hard. "I had to cover for someone at the register. I'm almost done." "Almost doesn't cut it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low, laced with quiet menace. "You've been slacking, Jessica. If you can't keep up, maybe you should start looking for another job." Ethan saw it then, the quick flash of panic in her eyes, the way her fingers clenched around the edge of the crate, as though holding on for dear life. She needed this job. Reynolds turned and walked away, satisfied with the damage he'd inflicted. Jessica's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Ethan forced himself to keep his composure, though his hands itched to do something, anything, to put an end to this. But he needed more. One bad manager didn't mean the entire company was rotten. But if this was happening here, how many other stores were the same? As the day stretched on, he observed more than he bargained for. Employees rushing through breaks, afraid of clocking in a minute too late. Others forcing smiles at impatient customers while their feet ached from standing too long without reprieve. And then there were the ones who had simply accepted their fate, who moved through their shifts like ghosts, their spirits long since broken. The final straw came during the evening rush. Ethan had stationed himself near the registers again, casually observing the checkout process, when Jessica's voice, shaky and urgent, broke through the noise. "Please, Mr. Reynolds, I just need a few more hours." "Anything. I can work the closing shift, I don't mind." Ethan turned sharply. Jessica stood at the end of the counter, facing Reynolds. Desperation clung to her every word. Reynolds barely spared her glance. "I told you we're not approving extra hours, right now." Jessica's hands trembled at her sides. "But she stopped, as if forcing herself to swallow her pride. "Sir, my rent went up. My son needs. Reynolds scoffed. Not my problem. You should learn to manage your money better. Ethan felt something inside him snap. The customers in line pretended not to hear, but he saw the way they shifted uncomfortably, how a few of them stole sympathetic glances in Jessica's direction. Reynolds turned to leave, but Ethan stepped forward, his voice cool and even. Seems unfair. Reynolds stopped, frowning as he turned to face him. Excuse me? Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if he were just another customer making an offhand comment. She's willing to work. You have shifts to fill. Seems like a win-win. Reynolds narrowed his eyes, his gaze raking over Ethan's unassuming attire. And who exactly are you? Ethan gave a small, knowing smile. Just someone who pays attention. Reynolds scoffed. Mind your business. But Ethan wasn't finished. Or maybe you're just the kind of manager who enjoys having power over people who can't afford to fight back. The air between them grew taut. A few customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Jessica's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as she looked between them. Reynolds took a step closer, lowering his voice. I don't know who you think you are, but if you're trying to cause trouble, you can take it somewhere else. Ethan met his glare without flinching. You're right. You don't know who I am. He let the words settle, his gaze unwavering. But you will soon enough. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Reynolds' face. Ethan turned and walked away, his pulse steady, his decision made. Tomorrow, the mask would come off. The next morning, Ethan stepped into Brightmart, but this time, he wasn't hiding. Gone were the casual clothes and the unassuming demeanor. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, his presence commanding. Employees who had ignored him before now took notice, their eyes widening with recognition as whispers rippled across the store. Reynolds was in the middle of berating a cashier when he turned and spotted Ethan. His face twisted in confusion before settling into something closer to annoyance. You again, he scoffed. I don't have time for... Ethan raised a hand, silencing him with a calm authority that needed no words. I think you do, Ethan said, his voice even but firm. Jessica, who had been bagging groceries nearby, froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked between them, realization dawning on her face. She wasn't alone. Employees gathered, cautious yet curious, sensing that something bigger than the daily grind was unfolding before them. Reynolds let out a sharp laugh, though a hint of unease flickered in his expression. And who do you think you are, walking in here like you own the place? Ethan held his gaze, then spoke, each syllable deliberate. I do own the place. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. The sound of scanning registers and beeping price checks seemed distant, muffled beneath the weight of Ethan's revelation. Reynolds blinked, his mouth opening slightly before snapping shut. The color drained from his face as he forced out a weak, incredulous chuckle. That's a good one. But no one else was laughing. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out his ID and placing it on the counter. The name, *** Ethan Graves, CEO of Brightmart Corporation, ***, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Murmurs swelled through the store. Jessica covered her mouth with her hand. Luis, who had been watching from the back, looked as though he'd forgotten how to breathe. Reynolds swallowed hard. This is a joke. His voice lacked its usual sharp edge, uncertainty creeping into his tone. Ethan folded his arms, his expression unreadable. A joke? Like denying a hard-working single mother extra hours? Like intimidating employees into silence? Like treating human beings as disposable assets? Reynolds floundered, glancing around as if looking for an escape. I was just following company policy. Ethan's jaw tightened. You were following your policy. And it ends today. Reynolds straightened, grasping at the last threads of his authority. You can't just... I can, Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. And I will... He turned, his gaze sweeping across the gathered employees. For weeks, I've been working in my own stores. Listening, observing, seeing what happens when no one thinks the boss is watching. He exhaled, his tone heavy with disappointment. What I found was unacceptable. Jessica's eyes shimmered with emotion, her lips pressed together to keep from breaking. Ethan turned back to Reynolds. You've created a culture of fear. You've crushed the very people who make this company successful. And for what? To make yourself feel powerful? Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. He had nothing left to defend himself with. You're done here, Ethan stated simply. The words hung in the air, irreversible. Reynolds' face turned red, his chest rising in shallow breaths. You can't just fire me. I can. Ethan's eyes darkened. And I already did. 2 corporate security officers stepped forward, having arrived quietly moments ago. Reynolds' bravado cracked. His hands curled into fists, his jaw tightening before he exhaled sharply, realization settling in. Without another word, he turned and stalked toward the exit. His departure met with quiet, stunned silence. Ethan let out a slow breath, then turned to face the employees. Things will change. I promise you that. His voice softened, but the weight of his words remained. But I need your help. I need to hear from you. No more fear. No more silence. For the first time, the employees looked at him not as some distant figure on a corporate website, but as a leader who had seen them. Really, seen them. Jessica wiped at her eyes, then nodded, stepping forward. We'll hold you to that, Mr. Graves. Ethan gave her a small, knowing smile. Good. Ethan Graves stood in the middle of the Brightmart store, the same place where, just weeks ago, he had walked in as an unnoticed, nameless employee. But now, every pair of eyes in the room was on him, waiting, hopeful, yet uncertain. The air felt different, no longer weighed down by fear, but filled with cautious anticipation. Jessica, standing near the front of the crowd, still wore her gray uniform, but something in her posture had changed. She was no longer shrinking into the background, no longer afraid of being seen. Ethan stepped forward, letting his gaze travel over each of the employees gathered before him. The weight of their struggles, their exhaustion, their hope, it was all there, written across their faces. These were not just numbers on a corporate report. These were people. I made a mistake, he said, his voice steady but sincere. I built a company and I thought I understood it. I thought that by looking at profit margins and efficiency reports, I could see everything I needed to see. But I was wrong. A murmur passed through the group, a mixture of surprise and curiosity. How often did a CEO admit they were wrong? I walked through these doors thinking I knew how this company worked. I believed that if we followed policies, if we hit our goals, then everything was running as it should. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. But I was blind to what was really happening. Jessica's fingers tightened around the edges of her apron. I watched employees struggle to make ends meet. I saw managers enforcing rules without compassion, prioritizing numbers over people. And I saw good, hard-working individuals like Jessica beg for the chance to work more, just to survive, only to be dismissed like they were nothing. Jessica lowered her gaze, but a flicker of something, perhaps gratitude, crossed her face. Ethan turned to the rest of the employees. That ends today. A ripple of movement spread through the group. Shoulders lifted, cautious, but intrigued. Effective immediately. We are reevaluating our scheduling policies. No more employees fighting for extra hours while struggling to pay rent. No more part-timers stuck under artificial caps that keep them from getting benefits. We're restructuring the way we do things, and that means putting people first. The room was silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath, unsure whether to believe him. Then, from the back of the crowd, Luis stepped forward. Words are easy, he said, his voice firm but respectful. But how do we know you'll follow through? How do we know this isn't just something you say now and forget in a few months? A valid question. Ethan nodded. Because I'm not just going to make promises. I'm putting action behind them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, placing it on the counter in front of him. We're implementing an employee advisory board made up of people from the store level, not just corporate. Jessica, Luis, if you're willing, I want you on it. You'll have a direct line to me, and I expect you to hold me accountable. Jessica's eyes widened. Luis blinked. The other employees exchanged looks, their skepticism beginning to crack under something dangerously close to hope. Ethan continued, his voice steady. We're also reassessing wages. I won't pretend we can fix everything overnight, but we are increasing base pay across all stores. No employee should be working full-time and still struggling to put food on the table. The murmur this time was louder, filled with cautious optimism. One of the cashiers, an older woman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. And what about the managers like Reynolds? The ones who made this place miserable. Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of the former manager. They'll be gone. But more importantly, we're changing how we choose managers. No more promotions based purely on numbers. Leadership should be about people, not just profit margins. For the first time, Jessica smiled. A moment of silence stretched through the store before, slowly, applause broke out. It was hesitant at first, then growing, spreading through the employees. It wasn't just about the words Ethan had said, it was about the fact that, for the first time, they felt seen. After the meeting, as the employees began to return to their work with a renewed energy, Jessica approached him. You meant everything you said, didn't you? She asked. Ethan met her gaze. Every word. She nodded, a small but genuine smile on her face. Then let's get to work. Ethan smiled back. It wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time, he knew he was on the right path. Brightmart would be different. And this time he would make sure of it.